12,000 Confederate soldiers surrendered in a single morning because their general boarded a steamboat and ran. 30,000 more surrendered on the 4th of July because two generals refused to talk to each other. And at Gettysburg, 12,500 men walked across open ground into certain death because one man was too blinded by his own victories to listen. The Confederacy didn't lose the Civil War in battle. They lost it in the moments just before the battles, in the decisions made by men who should have known better. It wasn't a singular event. It was a sequence of fractures, a series of deliberate, cold, and catastrophic decisions made by men who believed they were writing their own destiny, only to find they were reading their own obituary. Decision 1. Fort Donelson, February 1862. General John B. Floyd commanded roughly 12,000 Confederate soldiers at Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River in Tennessee. On February 15, his men broke through Grant's encircling lines. They had an open road south. The escape route was there. The order to move was all that stood between 12,000 Confederate soldiers and survival. Floyd called them back. He ordered his men back into the fort. Then he surrendered command to General Simon Bolivar Buckner, a man he was effectively handing a death sentence, boarded a steamboat, and fled downriver to avoid capture. The following morning, Buckner sent Grant a note requesting terms. Grant's reply became famous: no terms except unconditional and immediate surrender. Buckner had no choice. 12,000 Confederate soldiers laid down their arms in a single morning. It was the largest Confederate surrender of the war to that point. It handed Grant his nickname, Unconditional Surrender Grant. It opened the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers to Union gunboats. It forced the evacuation of Nashville, the first Confederate state capital to fall into Union hands. It cracked the entire Western defensive line wide open before the war was a year old. John B. Floyd is not a name that appears in most Civil War documentaries. He should be. Buckner had served alongside Grant at West Point. He knew exactly what unconditional surrender meant, not just as a military term, but as a personal humiliation delivered by a man he had once called a friend. The soldiers Floyd abandoned had no such context. They simply woke up on the morning of February 16 to find their commanding general gone, their fate signed away by a man who had no authority left to sign anything, and a war that had just gotten significantly harder to win. Decision 2. Shiloh, April 1862. General Albert Sidney Johnston held the momentum. The Union Army was backed against the Tennessee River, chaotic and broken. It was a moment of pure, blinding opportunity, the kind that comes once in a war, if at all. Johnston was pressing it. He was driving it. Then a bullet found him in the back of his knee, and he bled out in the saddle before anyone realized the wound was fatal. He was the highest-ranking officer on either side to die in combat during the entire war. Command passed to P.G.T. Beauregard. He looked at the carnage, the blood soaking the peach orchards, the exhausted men, the failing light, and he decided the fight was over for the day. He halted the assault. He sent word to Jefferson Davis that a great victory had been won. He gave the Union the one thing they could not buy: time. That night, the river ran black with reinforcements. Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio arrived by steamboat in the dark. By dawn, the impossible had happened. The Union didn't just hold the line, they pushed the Confederacy back into the mud. Beauregard's decision to stop transformed a battle the Confederacy was winning into a defeat that cost them the initiative in the Western theater for the rest of the war. He had held the killing blow in his hands. He put it down. Decision 3. Vicksburg, summer 1863. The defense of Vicksburg was not a tactical failure, it was a psychological one. General Joseph E. Johnston and General John C. Pemberton were meant to work in tandem, two Confederate forces coordinating to break Grant's siege from outside and inside simultaneously. Instead, they played a game of ego that 30,000 men paid for with their surrender and their dignity. Johnston, commanding the relief force miles to the east, refused to commit. He was paralyzed by the fear of losing his own army in a failed relief attempt, so he did nothing, writing letters, requesting reinforcements from Richmond, watching from a distance as Pemberton's position deteriorated week by week. Inside the city, Pemberton's men had stopped eating rations. They were eating mules, then rats. The civilian population had stopped pretending the siege was temporary. Families had dug caves into the hillsides above the city to escape the relentless Union bombardment and were living in them. Children were being born in those caves, delivered by candlelight into a city that was consuming itself from the inside out. Above ground, the streets were empty. Below ground, Vicksburg was dying by inches, while Johnston's army camped safely to the east and waited for a better moment that was never going to come. They were two capable men who refused to communicate in the one moment when communication was the only thing that could have saved them. On July 4, 1863, one day after Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, Pemberton surrendered the city. 30,000 Confederate soldiers laid down their arms. The Mississippi River passed entirely into Union control. The Confederacy was physically cut in two. Nobody understood the silence between those two commanders until the city fell. By then, understanding it changed nothing. Decision 4. Chickamauga and Missionary Ridge, Autumn, 1863. Braxton Bragg is a name that haunts the annals of the Confederacy, and no single chapter of that haunting is darker than Autumn 1863. At Chickamauga in September, Bragg achieved the impossible. He shattered the Union line. He sent the Army of the Cumberland fleeing in a disorganized, panicked retreat towards Chattanooga. General William Rosecrans, the Union commander, was so shaken by the collapse that he rode away from the battlefield entirely. The war in the West was within Confederate reach. Bragg refused to pursue. His subordinates begged him. Nathan Bedford Forrest, one of the most aggressive cavalry commanders of the war, rode to Bragg's headquarters in open fury and told him the opportunity was slipping away by the hour. Bragg refused. He sat consumed by his own grievances, his running feud with Leonidas Polk, his contempt for D.H. Hill, his corrosive suspicion of every general beneath him, and watched as the window slammed shut. The Union recovered, reorganized, and Grant arrived to take command. What followed at Missionary Ridge in November was not a defeat, it was a dissolution. Bragg held every tactical advantage, the high ground, the supply lines, a fortified ridge that should have been impregnable. Union soldiers, acting without orders, simply charged straight up the slope. They were not supposed to go that far. Their officers had not told them to. They went anyway. And Bragg's army, the same army that had shattered the Union at Chickamauga 2 months earlier, broke and ran from the crest of a ridge it had every reason to hold. The Confederate line dissolved from the center outward. Men threw down their rifles and fled. It was one of the most inexplicable military collapses in American history, and it opened Georgia to Sherman's march. Atlanta was now inevitable. The road to the sea was open. Decision 5. Gettysburg, July 1863. Robert E. Lee had built the Army of Northern Virginia into something that functioned almost as an extension of his own mind. His men believed in him with a completeness that bordered on the unconditional. That faith had carried them through Second Bull Run, through Fredericksburg, through Chancellorsville. It was also, at Gettysburg, the thing that killed them. James Longstreet, Lee's most trusted corps commander, saw the Union position on Cemetery Ridge for what it was, a killing ground. He argued against the assault on July 3rd with an urgency that he rarely brought to disagreements with Lee. He ordered the charge. 12,500 men stepped out of the tree line and walked nearly a mile of open ground into the concentrated fire of the Army of the Potomac. In under an hour, roughly half of them were dead, wounded, or captured. The survivors came back in silence. Lee rode out to meet them and saw what Pickett's charge had actually produced. These were not the men that had stepped off the ridge an hour ago. Some were weeping openly. Some were walking without direction, moving purely by instinct, their minds still somewhere out in that field. The formation that came back was a ghost of the one that had left, and every officer watching from the Confederate line understood in that moment that the Army of Northern Virginia had spent something it did not have the reserves to replace. Lee told them it was all his fault. He meant it, but meaning it changed nothing about what the Army of Northern Virginia had just lost in that field. Men it could not replace, momentum it would never recover, and the last realistic chance of forcing a negotiated end to the war. 5 decisions, 5 men, 5 moments where the choice made was the wrong one, and the cost of that choice was paid not by the men who made it, but by the tens of thousands who trusted them. These generals were not fools. Beauregard had won at First Bull Run. Floyd had served as Secretary of War. Johnston was considered by many the finest defensive mind in the Confederacy. Bragg had genuine tactical ability when he chose to use it. Lee was by any measure one of the great commanders of the 19th century. That is precisely what makes these failures so devastating. They were not defeated by incompetence. They were defeated by hesitation, by ego, by the paralysis that comes when a man trusts his own judgment more than the evidence in front of him. The Confederacy made 5 choices. Every single one was wrong.